Will's new venture, the steeped leaf, was certainly a statement. Mason took a long drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing amber in the twilight, and gestured with it toward the minimalist sign hanging above the door. He asked what on earth the name, the Still Point, was supposed to mean. The two words were etched onto a piece of weathered wood in a severe, clean font. It was the kind of thing you'd find in a high-end gallery, not a neighborhood tea lounge. Will just laughed, a deep, satisfied sound. He explained that people these days didn't just want tea. They wanted an experience, a narrative. The more abstract and inscrutable the name, the more customers would assume a depth and culture that justified the $15 price for a pot of oolong. Mason shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips, and flicked an ash into the street. He teased Will that it was just a fancy way of pulling a fast one on people. After a few more minutes of friendly banter, they went inside. The moment the door closed, a chorus of cheerful greetings for Will echoed from the staff. Mason had to admit, as he took in the space, that Will had created something impressive, at least on the surface. The room was a mix of industrial chic and warm wood. Polished concrete floors were softened by an assortment of mismatched vintage armchairs and long communal tables made from reclaimed timber. A gleaming copper samovar stood proudly behind the counter, looking both ancient and utterly modern. The most peculiar detail was the soundscape. Faintly, through the murmur of conversation and the clink of ceramic, came the soulful, melancholic strains of a blues guitar. It was an odd choice, and Mason found himself looking around, trying to pinpoint its source. Will, noticing his curiosity, launched into a proud tour of his establishment, his voice a low, constant murmur of explanations. The main floor was for casual drop-ins, the upstairs for private bookings. He described the aesthetic as a deconstructed vintage feel, a place where the atmosphere was as important as the product. Mason, who had stubbed out his cigarette before entering, felt the familiar itch of empty hands and shoved them into his pockets. Will's enthusiasm was infectious, though, and he pointed toward a side door covered by a dark curtain of wooden beads. He revealed that the back opened onto an old alleyway where a group of old-timers gathered every evening to play the blues. That music, he boasted, was his lounge's own Tenron background score, absolutely perfect. With that explanation, the mystery of the music was solved. Mason glanced at the beaded curtain, which rattled softly in the draft from the air conditioner. He could see slivers of the fading daylight through it, but the scene beyond remained obscured. Will asked if he preferred to sit upstairs or down. Mason opted for the main floor, saying he wanted to listen to the music. They chose a small table by the large front window. When it came to tea, Mason had neither the knowledge nor the pretension for anything fancy. He stuck to his habit and ordered a simple black coffee. Will settled into the chair opposite him, crossing one leg over the other, and asked what brought Mason out on a weekday evening, a rare sight. A project at work had run into a snag, Mason explained as the server set down his steaming mug. It was temporarily suspended, so he was on an indefinite leave. Will's relaxed posture vanished. He leaned forward, his expression one of genuine surprise, questioning the idea of a project issue being serious enough to sideline Mason. Mason, however, seemed unconcerned, giving a casual nod as he lifted the mug. Will stared at him, his brow furrowed, pressing for more information. He couldn't imagine what kind of problem would force a workaholic like Mason to take time off. Instead of answering directly, Mason took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the mug down and first complimented the brew, remarking that it was genuinely good. Will waved the praise away. If even Mason, with his unrefined palate, could appreciate the coffee, then the steeped leaf was destined for greatness. Mason chuckled softly to himself before finally elaborating. It wasn't just the project, he admitted quietly. He had gotten into a heated argument with his director. An argument with his director? Will's jaw practically dropped. In all the years he'd known Mason, the man had carried himself with the unshakable composure of someone twice his age. He was always the calm observer, never losing his temper, never letting any situation fluster him. Before Will could probe further, a young barista in a linen apron appeared at the top of the short staircase leading to the upper level. He called down that Will had a customer asking for him. The interruption saved Mason from an interrogation. Will sighed, called back an affirmative, and told Mason to make himself comfortable. He'd be back in a few minutes. Mason waved him off, indicating it was no problem. Left alone, Mason settled into a comfortable solitude, slowly sipping his coffee. His life was typically consumed by his work, a focused and often monotonous existence spent in the secure, isolated environment of an aerospace research facility. There was little room for hobbies or leisurely pursuits. But sitting here, in the warm glow of the lounge, surrounded by the low hum of strangers' conversations and the distant, mournful guitar, he felt a strange sense of returning to a simpler, more peaceful reality. The chaotic symphony of everyday life, the chatter, the footsteps, the music drifting in from the alley, was a novel and oddly comforting experience. He couldn't make out the lyrics the men in the alley were singing, but the melody was raw and beautiful. Mason tapped his fingers on the table, thinking that since he had all this unexpected time off, perhaps he should seek out a real blues club, experience the art form properly. Just as the thought crossed his mind, the music outside stopped. It was replaced by a wave of hearty, rumbling laughter. He could tell it was a group of older men, but mixed in with their deep chuckles was a single, clearer, younger voice. It was an anomaly that piqued his curiosity. His coffee cup was empty for the third time. As Mason was pouring himself a fourth from the small carafe left on the table, a new sound began. A cascade of intricate, crystalline notes from the guitar filled the air, so sudden and arresting that it startled him. His hand jerked, and hot coffee sloshed over the side of the mug, pooling in a dark puddle on the wooden tabletop. In a flustered reaction, he tried to steady the carafe with his free hand, but his fingers brushed against the hot ceramic and he recoiled with a sharp intake of breath. A man in his 30s scalded while pouring coffee. He felt a flash of self-deprecation, but the pain in his fingers was a distant concern. The melody winding its way through the air was captivating, each note a hook that seemed to pull at something deep inside him. He paused for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, leaving the spilled coffee and the slight sting in his hand, he stood up and walked toward the side door. The music shifted again as he approached, the long, soulful notes giving way to a rapid, complex finger-picking pattern. Mason's steps faltered, and he stopped just before the beaded curtain. He could see the silhouettes of several figures through the gaps, backlit by the alley lights. Then, the melody returned to its initial, haunting theme. Mason finally raised his hand and pushed aside the curtain. The wooden beads clattered, startling a few pigeons that had been pecking at crumbs on the steps. There, clustered around a worn patio table, were several gray-haired men. But Mason's eyes were drawn to the young man seated among them, a classical guitar resting in his lap. He was dressed simply in gray athletic shorts and a plain white t-shirt, dappled with the shifting shadows of an overhanging tree. From Mason's vantage point, he could only see the man in profile. The music reached a crescendo, and the young man's hand became a blur over the strings. When the final, resonant note faded into the evening air, the spell was broken. Mason felt a sudden hollowness in his chest, a void that was only filled when the old men broke into applause and shouts of approval. His own heart seemed to restart with the sound. The young man was speaking, assuring one of the old-timers that the instrument was a good one, a worthy purchase. He then stood and passed the guitar to a young woman who had been standing nearby. As he turned, Mason lost his profile view, seeing only the straight line of his back and his squared shoulders. The young woman said a few words, then sat down with the guitar, looking on with admiration. The young man picked up another guitar from the stone table, this one looking even more exquisite than the first. He sat down again and strummed a few experimental chords. The other musicians joined in, and one of the old men began to sing a blues verse in a gravelly voice. Mason barely registered the song. His entire attention was fixed on the man playing the accompaniment on the guitar. After a short verse, he heard the guitarist laugh and call out to the singer, a man named Gus, telling him he should try a different set of lyrics. A lively debate followed, with everyone chiming in, until someone challenged the young man to sing a little himself. The young man smiled, a slight tilt of his head, and his left hand moved to the fretboard. This time, only the sound of his guitar filled the alley. Then he began to sing, his voice clear and unexpectedly poignant. The lyrics spoke of casting aside worldly ambitions for the simple pleasure of a dream. He sang with a smile still on his face, his expression one of carefree abandon. It was an unexpected, intense moment, and though it was only early summer, Mason felt as if he'd been struck by a blinding light. If anyone had ever spoken to him of love at first sight, Mason would have dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. But now he wasn't so sure. The jam session seemed to be over for the night. The old men exchanged a few more jokes, then began to pack up their instruments and fold their chairs. The young man, however, remained seated, his head resting against the body of his guitar, his legs stretched out before him in a picture of lazy contentment. An old man walking by called out a greeting, asking if he wasn't working today. Ethan, he called him. The young man explained that he'd worked the night shift last night and was scheduled for it again tonight, having swapped with a colleague. Just hearing his voice, seeing that relaxed silhouette, Mason felt an urgent need to know more about this person. He took a couple of steps forward, closing the distance between them. The brick-paved alley was uneven, and he misjudged a step, his foot landing squarely on a loose stone. He caught his balance easily but paused, bent down, and kicked the offending stone to the side. The soft scraping sound must have caught the young man's attention. He turned his head and looked directly at Mason. Unprepared, Mason found himself locked in their first moment of eye contact. He had been so curious about the man's face, yet now that it was turned toward him, his attention was snagged by something else entirely. His hair. It was still damp, and the turn of his head had tousled the dark strands across his forehead into a chaotic, endearing mess. Had he just showered after his shift? Overall, the man had a mature, composed air, but as he looked at Mason, an undeniable wave of youthful energy seemed to emanate from him, perhaps accentuated by that damp, unruly hair. He offered Mason a small, polite smile and a nod. Mason returned the gesture. Then, acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, Mason closed the remaining distance and stood beside him. The young man seemed surprised that he had approached but quickly masked it. He stood up courteously, still holding his guitar. Mason felt a wave of awkwardness. He managed to smile and explained that he had heard him playing from inside the lounge and thought it was truly beautiful. It was the first time in his life he had ever approached a stranger like this, and the words felt clumsy and plain in his own ears. The young man simply said thank you. The conversation stalled. Mason adjusted his glasses and, without missing a beat, began to fabricate a story. He explained that his niece had been talking about learning to play the guitar, and for a moment, he had mistaken him for a professional instructor and had been about to ask if he took on students. The young man tilted his head slightly, a playful, appraising look in his eyes. He repeated Mason's phrase. For a moment, he asked if that meant Mason no longer thought he was professional. Mason recognized the light-hearted teasing and his own smile widened. He clarified that wasn't it at all, but since he'd overheard him mentioning a night shift, he'd guessed that music wasn't his primary profession. His gaze drifted down to the young man's hands, which were remarkably elegant. He hazarded another guess that he was perhaps a doctor, maybe even a surgeon. This time, the young man laughed aloud and carefully set his guitar down on the stone table. He shook his head and confirmed that Mason's intuition was sharp. As they spoke, one of the old men waved goodbye. The young man, Ethan, waved back, and suddenly they were the only two people left under the tree. It was only now, face to face, that Mason truly took in his features. He wasn't classically handsome, but his face was clean-cut and well-defined, with an open, approachable quality. He confirmed that he was a doctor and that the guitar was just a hobby. He was glad Mason enjoyed it. For a moment, Mason hesitated, then decided on honesty. He admitted he liked it very much. Ethan looked at him then, a long, searching look that made Mason feel as though he were being seen right through. Ethan then smiled and remarked that he still didn't know his name. Mason felt a flush of embarrassment, realizing his own rudeness. He chuckled at his oversight and extended a hand. His name was Mason, he said, an engineer, and if it wasn't too forward, he hoped they could be friends. Ethan reached out to shake his hand but then quickly pulled back, apologizing. He explained he was still wearing his finger picks. Mason glanced down and saw the clear plastic picks attached to his fingernails with flesh-colored tape. Mason told him it was no problem, that it would be an honor. Ethan smiled and took his hand. Mason felt the unfamiliar texture of the medical tape against his skin. He introduced himself properly then. Ethan Shin, a thoracic surgeon at University Hospital. His introduction was more detailed than Mason's, so Mason felt compelled to add that he was an aerospace engineer working on ballistic missile systems. The information made Ethan's eyebrows rise. He commented that it sounded impressive. Mason just shook his head, saying it only sounded that way. As they spoke, Ethan began to deftly remove the finger picks, peeling away the tape and stacking the small pieces of plastic neatly. Mason watched, fascinated by the dexterity of his fingers. Ethan asked if Mason was there for tea, and Mason admitted he was just visiting his friend who owned the place, as he knew nothing about tea. Ethan laughed at his frankness, saying the tea there was excellent, and he'd be a regular if his job wasn't so demanding. He retrieved a small, heart-shaped tin from his guitar case and dropped the picks inside with a faint click. Then, to Mason's surprise, he pulled out a pair of round, gold-rimmed glasses and put them on. A stray beam of light caught the frame, tracing a golden arc. The glasses gave him a scholarly, yet still unstuffy air. Mason found himself thinking that he had never before considered using the words youthful and mature to describe the same person. It was a strange and compelling combination. "Mason, what are you doing out here?" Will's voice broke the moment. Mason turned to see his friend walking toward them. Will's eyes widened in recognition when he saw Ethan. He asked how the two of them knew each other. Mason explained they had just met, but he caught an underlying familiarity in Will's tone. It turned out Will had gotten to know Ethan from his frequent chats with the old-timers in the alley. Since they were all acquainted now, Will invited them both to sit down for a meal. He'd have the kitchen whip up some pasta. Mason readily agreed. Ethan, equally at ease, said he would just drop his guitar at home and be right back. Even after Ethan's figure disappeared around the corner, Mason found himself staring in that direction. Will nudged him, asking what he was still looking at. Mason just smiled without answering. Will started to head back inside, but Mason stopped him, saying he was going to have a cigarette first. Will clicked his tongue, observing that Mason seemed to be smoking more heavily lately. He asked how many he was going through a day. Mason pulled out his pack, showing Will the 3 cigarettes remaining from a pack he'd opened the day before. Will looked genuinely concerned, asking if Mason was trying to kill himself. Mason just shrugged, saying he couldn't help it. He lit a cigarette and told Will to go on ahead. After Will left, Mason finished his cigarette, but Ethan had not yet returned. He opened and closed the cigarette pack repeatedly before pulling out another. He had to admit he was smoking too much. As he exhaled a plume of smoke, a voice beside him remarked that he seemed to be quite fond of smoking. It was Ethan returned. Unlike his flippant response to Will, Mason paused. He ran a hand over his nose and explained that he smoked when he was tired, and once he started, he found it hard to stop. He offered the pack to Ethan, who had his hands in his pockets and politely declined, saying he wasn't particularly drawn to it. Without another word, Mason immediately stubbed out his half-finished cigarette in a nearby bin. Ethan looked surprised and asked why he stopped. Mason just said let's go, and led the way, holding the beaded curtain open for Ethan to pass through. Back at their table, Will was giving instructions to a server. The spilled coffee stain was still on the table. Mason had intended to take that seat himself, but Ethan sat down there first. Mason quickly asked a passing server for a cloth. Will asked Ethan what kind of pasta sauce he wanted. Ethan replied that he wasn't picky. To solve the problem of eating in a tea lounge, Will had a server place a small, professionally printed sign on their table. It read, "Reserved for owner and friends." Ethan laughed heartily at the display, nodding in approval and telling Will he was a genius. Mason, long used to Will's antics, ignored him. He turned to Ethan and asked him to spell his last name. Ethan smiled, dipped his finger into the small puddle of water left from the coffee spill, and traced the letters on the dark wood of the table. Sitchin. Mason watched, mesmerized. It seemed that every small gesture this man made had a unique grace, turning even the simple act of writing his name in water into a captivating piece of art. Mason became a near-daily fixture at the Steeped Leaf, more diligent in his attendance than Will, the owner. Will found it increasingly strange. This man, who was usually chained to his lab, was suddenly idle, almost like he was unemployed. After days of persistent questioning, Will finally managed to extract a sliver of information. A senior colleague, a mentor figure, had run into some trouble. An investigation was underway, and everyone involved was on temporary leave from all research activities. An investigation? Will was stunned. He knew the general, highly classified nature of Mason's work and was taken aback. He leaned in and asked quietly what had happened. Mason looked up from the newspaper he was reading, saw the anxious look on his friend's face, and simply said it was a sensitive matter and best not discussed. Will, not wanting to get involved in state secrets, wisely dropped the subject, only asking if Mason himself was okay. Mason shook his head, reassuring him, then picked up a pair of scissors and made the first cut into the newspaper. He explained that his part of the review was done. He was just waiting for further instructions. Will relaxed, taking a sip of tea. He then glanced at the scissors and clippings spread across the table and remarked that cutting articles out of the newspaper was a hobby for his grandfather's generation. Mason shot him a look and retorted that in that case Will should start calling him Grandpa. After meticulously cutting and pasting the day's articles into his scrapbook, Mason finally sat back and organized his supplies. He glanced at the sun outside, estimated the time, and prepared to leave. Will offered to have him stay for dinner, but Mason declined. His sister, Mia, was coming over, and he had to cook for her. As he walked out, he couldn't help but glance toward the side door. Despite their pleasant lunch that first day, he hadn't seen Ethan since, even with his daily visits. On a whim, he decided to walk over to the alley door. He wasn't expecting anything, just trying his luck. But perhaps fate was on his side, because when he pushed through the beaded curtain, he saw him. This time, there was no music. Ethan was alone, crouched in the narrow strip of shade along the wall, a cigarette held between his fingers. He was squinting, his gaze distant, fixed on the rooftops across the alley. His clothes were wrinkled, and he looked utterly exhausted. Mason called his name. Ethan turned, his face shadowed as he looked up at him. Mason walked over. He asked if Ethan had just gotten off work. Ethan managed a tired smile and nodded, flicking ash from his cigarette. Mason noted that he looked exhausted. Up close, the fatigue was even more pronounced. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles underneath them stark, and the faint shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. He brought the cigarette to his lips, his mouth dry and chapped. He explained that 2 of his patients had been in critical condition the night before, and then a car crash victim had been brought in. He hadn't stopped all night. He was so tired that he didn't even stand up, just tilted his head back to look up at Mason. So Mason crouched down beside him. The sight of 2 grown men huddled together on the ground was slightly comical, but also strangely endearing. Mason suggested he should go home and get some sleep. Ethan nodded, saying he would head back after he finished his cigarette. Mason's gaze fell to his hand. He commented that he had thought Ethan didn't smoke. Ethan paused, then chuckled softly, as if recalling their first conversation. He clarified that he didn't smoke much, just very sparingly. He held up one finger, the cigarette wobbling between 2 others. He only smoked 1 per month. Mason raised his eyebrows in disbelief, repeating the phrase, 1 a month? Ethan confirmed it with a nod. He then noticed the scrapbook and papers in Mason's hands and asked what they were. Mason explained his hobby of keeping a clipping scrapbook, calling it an old-fashioned pastime. Ethan, however, seemed genuinely interested and asked if he could see it. With Mason's permission, he carefully took the book, balancing it on his lap as he gently turned the pages. Mason watched him, his attention drawn to the serious expression on Ethan's face. Ethan noted the detailed annotations and insightful comments Mason wrote alongside each article. He remarked that it was a rare habit these days. Mason explained it was something his father had made him do in middle school, and it had stuck. Seeing Ethan's genuine interest, Mason offered to let him borrow it. Ethan immediately looked up and refused, pointing out that Mason worked on it daily and wouldn't be able to if he took it. Mason suggested he could just consolidate a few days' work. Ethan still declined but asked if he could perhaps see some of Mason's older scrapbooks instead. Mason agreed, saying he would bring them next time and leave them with Will if they didn't run into each other. The cigarette burned down quickly. Ethan stubbed it out and stood up to throw it away. As he turned to leave, he froze, a strange expression on his face. Mason asked if he wasn't going. Ethan let out a quiet cough, a half-smile playing on his lips. His legs had fallen asleep. He said it without a trace of embarrassment, his honesty so disarming that Mason couldn't help but laugh. He asked how long Ethan had been crouching there. Surely 1 cigarette couldn't have done that much damage. Ethan checked his watch and guessed it had been about half an hour. Mason chuckled and offered to help him up. Ethan waved him off, saying he just needed to stand for a minute. As they stood there, Ethan suddenly remembered Mason's lie from their first meeting. He mentioned that if Mason still needed help picking out a guitar for his niece, he was off on Saturday and could go with him. Mason was momentarily taken aback, having forgotten his own fabrication. He recovered quickly, though, and gratefully accepted the offer. Ethan added that it would be best if his niece could come along, as he believed choosing an instrument was a very personal thing. The thought of Mia made Mason feel a pang of guilt, wondering how he would explain the sudden appearance of a guitar. Still, he calmly agreed to ask her. After a few more minutes, Ethan stamped his feet and jumped in place a few times, declaring that feeling had returned. He invited Mason over to his place for lunch. Mason's heart skipped a beat. It was a perfect opportunity to get closer, but the thought of his sister waiting at home made him regretfully decline. He explained that Mia was home and he needed to cook for her. Ethan's surprise was evident in his voice when he asked if Mason could cook. Mason countered by asking if he didn't look the type. Ethan gave him a thorough theatrical once-over and admitted that, no, he didn't. An aerospace engineer with a penchant for newspaper clippings didn't exactly scream domestic. Mason explained that with his parents often away for work, he had been the one to look after Mia for much of their childhood, and he'd learned to cook out of necessity. He added with a smile that he was decent at it and offered to cook for Ethan sometime. Ethan's eyes lit up at the prospect. Before they parted, they arranged to meet at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. Mason would pick him up. When Mason got home, he found Mia already on the couch, surrounded by snack bags. He raised an eyebrow at the bag of chips in her hand and asked if she wasn't supposed to be dieting for her engagement photos. Mia defiantly shoved another chip in her mouth and announced that the photo shoot was off. The wedding was off. It seemed she and her fiancé had had another fight. It wasn't about anything major, in Mason's opinion. This time, it was because she had commented that a former classmate in a photo looked handsome. She followed Mason into the kitchen, ranting about how petty her fiancé was being. Mason, busy chopping vegetables, finally turned and asked if she was asking for his opinion. Mia faltered, then sighed, leaning against the counter. She conceded that asking a lifelong bachelor like him for relationship advice was probably pointless. Mason calmly threatened to stop cooking if she didn't stop insulting him. Mia playfully poked him in the ribs, and he flinched away, telling her to stop. She then grew serious, asking if he was upset that she was getting married before him. She said that he had practically raised her, and if he felt even a little bit unhappy about it, she would call the whole thing off. Mason found the idea absurd and asked why on earth he would be uncomfortable. She listed off potential feelings: loneliness, awkwardness, panic, before declaring that his own romantic life had been dormant for years. Fed up with the nonsensical conversation, Mason shooed her out of the kitchen. As he returned to his cooking, the image of Ethan crouching in the alley, a cigarette between his fingers, surfaced in his mind. He paused, staring out the window at the clear sky, lost in thought. The guitar shop Ethan took him to was tucked away in a quiet alley, a hidden gem shielded by the sprawling branches of a large oak tree. As they got out of the car, Ethan let out a huge yawn. Mason asked if he hadn't slept well. He'd already seen him yawn 3 times on the drive over. Even though Ethan had confirmed the previous night that he didn't have to work, Ethan admitted he'd stayed up until 4 in the morning binge-watching movies he'd been meaning to see. The morning light illuminated his tired face. Mason joked that such behavior didn't seem very fitting for someone who claimed to be health-conscious. Ethan led the way to the shop, pushing his glasses up to rub his sleep-reddened eyes. He replied with a simple, decisive statement: Occasional indulgence is harmless. The sheer self-assurance in his tone made Mason laugh. The owner of the shop was surprisingly young, a guy who looked more like a college student than a luthier. He greeted Ethan as senior. Ethan introduced Mason, explaining they were there to pick out a guitar for his niece. The owner, Leo, shook Mason's hand. Ethan quickly pointed out a beautiful redwood guitar, suggesting it was perfect for a beginner who was serious about learning, good quality without being excessively expensive. Leo handed the instrument to Mason. Holding the unfamiliar object, Mason felt completely out of his depth. He looked at Ethan, who was trying to hide a smile. Mason asked if Ethan would test it out for him. It was the first time Mason had watched him attach his fingerpicks up close. The process was unhurried but fluid. Once they were on, Ethan looked at Mason and asked what he wanted to hear. Almost without thinking, Mason requested the song he had been playing the first time they met. Ethan thought for a moment, then identified the piece as E-Dance. He expertly tuned the strings, then asked if Mason wanted to hear the whole thing. Mason replied that it would be an honor. The last time he had heard this piece, it was outdoors, mixed with the sounds of the wind and the chatter of old men. Here, in the enclosed, quiet space of the shop, the music was even more powerful, each note resonating with stunning clarity. When the final chord faded, Mason was speechless. It was Leo who spoke first, praising his senior's skill. Ethan just laughed it off. He then turned to Mason, who was staring at him with an intensity that took him by surprise. It was a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. Ethan strummed a single chord to break the silence and asked if it was good. Mason, snapping out of his trance, confirmed that it was magnificent. They decided on the guitar. Leo offered them the one in the shop or a newly made one from the workshop. Mason deferred to Ethan, who said his personal preference was always to wait for a new instrument. There was something special, he explained, about being with an instrument from the moment of its birth. Mason, charmed by the romantic notion, agreed to wait. While Mason was paying, Ethan wandered around the shop, admiring a vintage record player. Leo offered to have one custom-made for him, but Ethan politely declined, saying it would just gather dust in his house. As Leo wrote up the invoice, his hand paused, but he kept his head down, so Mason couldn't see his expression. Once they were back in the car, Mason asked about Leo's relationship with Ethan. Ethan explained that Leo was his late mother's last and most talented student. He recounted stories of Leo's rebellious childhood, how he had been sent to live with Ethan's family to be straightened out by his mother, a renowned musician. As Ethan spoke of his mother, Mason sensed a subtle shift in his mood, a quiet melancholy that settled over him. He had a feeling something tragic had happened but refrained from asking. Suddenly, Mason's phone rang, shattering the quiet moment. He apologized to Ethan and answered it. The voice on the other end was a young woman, crying hysterically. Mason's expression darkened, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He promised to come and get her right away. He turned to Ethan, his face grim, and apologized. Something had come up and he had to go pick someone up. Ethan was understanding, telling him to just drop him at the nearest subway station if he was in a hurry. But as Mason made the turn, he changed his mind. He asked Ethan if he would be willing to join him for lunch, with the addition of a young woman who was in desperate need of cheering up. He admitted that he was terrible at comforting people and could use the help. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan agreed. Mason then explained the situation. The girl, Chloe, was his protégé. Their mentor, a brilliant and highly respected senior researcher in their classified project, had disappeared 2 weeks ago. The official assumption, he said grimly, was that he had either been abducted or had defected. Chloe had just found out and was devastated. The worst-case scenario, that their mentor was a traitor and years of their work was compromised, was now the official line of thinking. Ethan was silent for a long time, processing the shocking information. He murmured that he had always thought they lived in a time of peace. Mason explained that peace was a relative term. There were always shadows and unseen conflicts. He pointed out a clothing store they were passing, mentioning that it used to be a restaurant that was shut down because it was a front for espionage. Ethan's eyes widened. Mason said he admired Chloe, who was just 20 years old, for her resilience. He called her a genius. They drove far out of the city to a remote research facility, where they found Chloe sitting on a curb, crying, while a man in a formal suit stood by helplessly, offering her tissues. The man introduced himself as Shen Shiwei, a visiting scholar who was supposed to be meeting with her. Mason quickly arranged for a colleague to take the man to lunch and then turned his attention to Chloe. His attempt to comfort her by bluntly telling her that crying wouldn't help only made her cry harder. Ethan stepped in, gently coaxing her into the car. After a while, Chloe's sobs subsided. Her first words, spoken in a stuffy, tear-choked voice, were a request for dessert. They ended up at a bakery, where Chloe ordered nearly one of everything on the menu. Mason and Ethan watched in astonishment as she methodically worked her way through plate after plate of sweets. Fearing she would make herself sick, Ethan started eating as well, pushing a slice of cake toward Mason. Mason whispered that he hadn't eaten dessert since he was 7. Ethan, a smudge of chocolate on his lip, told him that just as eating too much sugar was bad, so was eating none at all. It was bad for one's mood, he claimed with a doctor's authority. Mason found the flawed logic endearing. Toward the end of their sugar binge, Chloe looked at Mason and announced that she was being transferred to a different department for a new assignment. She assured him she was fine and that she would finish the work her mentor had started. There was a fierce determination in her eyes that left Ethan deeply impressed. On the drive back, Ethan fell asleep. Mason dropped Chloe off, then drove around the city for hours, not wanting to wake him. It was late afternoon when Ethan finally stirred. Mason apologized profusely, realizing with a jolt that they had never actually eaten lunch. Ethan just laughed it off, saying he was too full of cake to be hungry anyway. He commented on how much Mason had eaten, and Mason had to confess that he'd started to feel sick after the third pastry, but couldn't let Chloe eat it all alone. As they were talking, Mason found himself thinking that Ethan would make some woman very happy someday. He was charming, kind, and incredibly perceptive. When he voiced this thought, Ethan, who was cleaning his glasses, simply looked at him and smiled. "I don't think I'll find a girl," he said casually, after putting his glasses back on. "I like men." The statement hung in the air. It wasn't the words themselves that stunned Mason, but the complete lack of drama or apology in Ethan's tone. He had said it as if he were commenting on the weather. After a long moment of silence, Mason found his voice. "Is it hard?" he asked quietly. "Being in a relationship with a man?" Ethan seemed surprised by the question. He rested his head against the window and thought for a moment. He said that the relationship itself wasn't hard, but dealing with the world's reactions could sometimes be unpleasant. Mason didn't press further. When they arrived at Ethan's neighborhood, Mason parked the car. Ethan got out, but then, instead of closing the door, he got back in. He looked at Mason and said he had to ask why Mason had asked him that question. Mason, turning off the engine, replied that he just had a feeling that Ethan might have had a difficult time in the past. He couldn't imagine someone developing such a calm, self-possessed demeanor without having gone through significant challenges. Ethan explained that his romantic history was not particularly dramatic, so he hadn't experienced too much hardship, But he added, with a knowing smile, that Mason's question was unique. Most people, upon learning he was gay, reacted with curiosity or judgment, but no one had ever asked if it was hard. Before getting out for good, he reminded Mason to call him when he was ready to pick up the guitar. As Mason watched him walk away, he saw Ethan duck into a small flower shop on the corner. The man was a constant source of surprises. A few days before Mia's wedding, a major military news story broke. Ethan sent Mason a screenshot of an online comment, asking if the technical analysis was accurate. Mason replied that the general idea was correct, but some details were wrong. 20 minutes later, Ethan received a detailed email from Mason, breaking down the technology in simple, easy-to-understand analogies. Ethan called him impressed, and Mason modestly insisted he was just an engineer, not a scientist. Ethan then steered the conversation back to a previous topic. He asked how the payment for flower viewing was coming along, a playful reference to an earlier invitation he'd extended for Mason to visit his garden. Mason's voice was warm when he replied that such a rare treasure was difficult to find. Ethan laughed, him that summer was almost over. Mason calmly retorted that Ethan had promised him a garden for all 4 seasons. Mia's wedding was a simple, elegant affair. Mason, who was set to walk her down the aisle in their father's absence, arrived early, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. He knew Ethan would be there, as he'd seen his name on the guest list he'd written out himself. He was standing near the entrance, greeting guests, when he saw him. Ethan was walking toward the venue, holding a bouquet of flowers, looking more like he was on a casual neighborhood stroll than attending a wedding. Mason stepped out to greet him, a wide smile on his face. Ethan's initial surprise quickly turned to amused realization when he saw the boutonniere on Mason's lapel. He finally connected the dots between Mason and Mia. He admitted they always called her by a nickname, so he'd never noticed the similarity in their names. He looked down at the elegant script on his invitation and asked if Mason had written it. Mason confirmed that he had, a quiet pride in his voice. As they walked inside, they were approached by a handsome, well-dressed man who greeted Ethan with an unnerving intensity. Mason felt a strange tension from the man, a possessiveness in his gaze as he looked at Ethan. The conversation was brief and stilted, and as they walked away, Mason glanced back and saw the man was still standing there, watching them go. In the bridal suite, Mia greeted Ethan with a loud "My hero," and he laughingly presented her with the flowers. He explained that all but the lilies were from his own garden. Mason found himself staring at the vibrant, beautiful bouquet, a tangible piece of Ethan's hidden world. As Mia introduced Ethan to her bridesmaids, who immediately started fawning over him, Mason stepped in, creating a diversion to save him from their advances. Mia then tasked Ethan with managing the music for the ceremony, and Mason offered to show him the way. As they left the room, Mason explained that he was walking his sister down the aisle because their father, whose work was similar to his own, was unable to get away. Ethan looked at Mason's impeccable suit and then down at his own simple shirt and trousers, a comical look of dismay on his face. Mason just laughed, assuring him he looked great. When Mason returned to the main hall after changing, a beautiful, quiet Japanese song was playing. He saw Ethan by the sound system, engrossed in his task. He watched him for a long moment, unseen. The man who had entered his life so unexpectedly, with his music, his quiet strength, and his garden of all seasons, was here. And as the opening notes of the wedding march began to play, and Mason turned to walk his sister down the aisle, he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the rare treasure he had been searching for was finally within his grasp.